I once owned 6 cats. I'm down to 1. Katherine owned, I wouldn't say owned, but she had a whole lot more than that, and she can tell her about that. Let us introduce the panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Katherine?
Hi, I'm Katherine Kerestman. Oh. Can you hear me?
You can pull that out. Pull it out.
How's this?
Yeah.
I'm Katherine Kerestman, a former local Humane Society president, rescue worker, et cetera, et cetera. Once had a whole colony of my own, but now I have an empty nest. I'm privileged to be the proud co-editor with ST of The Weird Cat, which is #1 on Amazon in new releases and anthologies, and new releases in classic anthologies, as well as #5 in horror. It comes out officially on the 18th, but I cart around lots of books with me. It's an anthology of weird cat tales that includes dead writers. I had to use my Ouija board to get the dead writers on board. But it's been a very great, wild ride with ST putting this book out together, and I thank him so much for the opportunity for my editorial debut. I'm also the author of Creepy Cat's Macabre Travels, a nonfiction travel memoir of my trips in search of weird stories in Transylvania, Stonehenge, Lizzie Borden's house, the underground cities of China, etc. And Lethal, a little novella. And that's all you really need to know about me, unless you want to buy me drinks at the bar afterwards.
Hello there. My name is Tony LaMalfa, and I'm a former gym teacher, produced playwright, and I'm not sure how I really ended up here. But if I had to say, it probably was because of the folks at the table with the white tablecloth, specifically Mr. Joshi. He has been instrumental in helping me launch a book called Forbidden Knowledge, 2 Tales of Lovecraftian Terror, which came out this year on Lovecraft's birthday. So thanks to Hippocampus Press, we wanted to give a nod to the old gent. And essentially, it asks the question, why the hell would you read the Necronomicon, much less the entire thing, and how would you even survive with your sanity intact? So it bookends at the Mountains of Madness and follows young Danforth, whom the protagonist of that story rails left and right with his frail nerves. Well, how did he get that way? So you find out in the first half of these novellas here. And the second half follows a French anthropologist, Miriam Delacroix, to New Zealand, where she has an interest in studying indigenous cultures. So you find out how the 2 stories are inextricably linked by the end of the tale. So thank you to Hippocampus Press and so many other folks. Just because my name's on the cover doesn't mean I did all the work, especially my wife. She's my chief editor. Oh, good conversations over breakfast. But she's watching the girls right now, so I'm like, you're going to watch them for 5 days and you're okay with that? Our toddler and our baby? So bless her heart. Anyway, so I'm really excited to be a contributor to The Weird Cat. There's a short story I have called The Crimson Curse, and I'm very grateful to Katherine and ST for including that alongside such fantastic and other wonderful writers, like Katherine said, dead and alive. So to turn it over to one of the other living writers to have a piece included, I'll give it to you.
Hello, I'm Adam Bolivar. I'm a poet, writer, eccentric dresser, and marionette manipulator. So I have a fondness for cats, which is partly why I'm here. I'm also in this anthology, The Weird Cat, and I recently came out with I have a number of books published. My most recent one is a collection of alliterative poetry, which is the kind of poetry that was written before the Norman Conquest. So rather than rhyming, the beginnings of words assonate. There's a lot of rules to it, but I'm told this is the first collection of original alliterative poetry in the traditional Old English style ever published. And it has a couple of cat poems and some Lovecraftian poems too, and a lot of homages to mythology.
Okay, so that's who we are. Well, let us get to the most problematical issue at hand. I'm sure you all know what it is. Mr. Lovecraft, in his childhood, owned a cat, and we cannot pronounce that cat's name. He mentioned that cat's name in the story The Rats in the Walls. In my biography of Lovecraft, I said rather cavalierly that, that name was a common name given to black cats. Now, at the time I wrote that book, I am not entirely sure I had any evidence for that assertion. However, not terribly long ago, a colleague passed on a passage from a book written by somebody who studied the history of pet ownership in America. And sure enough, this woman, author, didn't say that the actual name that Lovecraft gives, but she says the black cats were named Nig. Okay, close enough. So it is quite obvious to me, at any rate, that nothing derogatory was meant. In fact, quite the contrary. I think Lovecraft was particularly fond of black cats because they symbolized a connection with the spaces beyond. In a letter of 1934, he talks about, this is a book called the H.P. Lovecraft Cat Book. It came out from Necronomicon Press a couple of years ago, and I'm hoping they'll reprint it. It's a little hard to find now, but I'm hopeful that they will revive and get this book back into print. But anyway, Lovecraft goes on in this letter. Says he was talking about another cat, Little Sam Perkins. We'll talk about him later, but who was also a black cat. And he says, "When I speak to Little Sam, I call him all sorts of things: little black devil, old N-word man, spawn of the shadows, little piece of the night, old black panther, little onyx sphinx, child of Bast," and so on and so on. So you can see that even that name with the N-word, they're meant to be complementary. It's the connection of cats with the outer darkness that fascinated Lovecraft. And I think, Adam, you had a specific theory, which I agree with, about how that cat, Lovecraft's actual cat, came to be named.
Oh, did I?
Well,
I did.
We were talking about it earlier.
I pointed out that it was a family cat when he was a child. It's actually true. He never actually, despite all the complimentary things he said about cats, he never actually owned a cat himself, did he?
Well, I mean,
except for this.
Except for this one.
Like as a child in his family's house, but it doesn't. It's probable that I think that he didn't actually name that cat himself, since it was his family.
Yeah, what happened was that, I mean, the only thing that I can remember, again, it's a quotation in this book,
It's not certain.
Yeah, we don't know who named the cat. What he says in a very late letter, like 2 months before his death, he says, "What a boy he," the cat, "was. I watched him grow from a tiny black handful to one of the most fascinating and understanding creatures I've ever seen," which clearly says that Lovecraft got that cat when he was a kitten. The cat was a kitten. We don't know how long that cat lived. I don't know if Lovecraft actually says so, but let's say he lived like 10 years, and the cat ran off when Lovecraft's family moved from his birthplace at 454 Angel Street, just a couple blocks down the street, to 598 Angel Street, a smaller house, and he moved because he was so tied to that birthplace. But the cat ran off, and that was sort of a symbol of the loss of his birthplace. But if they got the cat around 1894, it seems highly unlikely to me that he would have named the cat. The mother would have named the cat. The father was already out of the picture because he was, had a nervous breakdown.
Or maybe his grandfather.
Whatever. But, it's just a conjecture, but that's one way of looking at it.
I had cats when I was a child, and I didn't name our cats.
Yeah.
But, as we just heard in The Cats of Ulthar, Lovecraft derives special comfort from black cats. The plague had not been kind to him. It had left him this small furry thing to mitigate his sorrow. He's speaking from experience here. And when one is very young, one can find great relief in the antics of a black kitten. So clearly he loved this cat with the name that today is offensive.
Now, Tony, Is the Crimson Curse, your story, a kind of follow-up to the Cats of Altar, would you say?
You know, that's actually a really good point, ST. It was meant to fall in that vein. The short story inclusion that I have in The Weird Cat is The Crimson Curse, and follows a city engineer in Providence in the 1930s, and actually brings up some interesting points. This city engineer is all for the establishment of an interstate highway that would run right through the middle of town and wipe out Fox Point, which at the time was a district that had a lot of immigrants. And so, like many of the other stories in this book, The Weird Cat, they all have a kind of a moral of the story. And so this character, the city engineer, is given kind of a warning shot by none other than a cat from Ulthar, and to learn, to repent his wicked ways. And whether it's, a poem or an essay or some of the stories, that there seems to be a strong theme that cats are not only a gateway to what other realms or dimensions, things that we can't see, but they can be shepherds and forewarn us of dangers that we're not aware of, and companions in that regard. And yeah, the Crimson Curse is in a way an extension of the Cats of Ulthar. And the very quote that Katherine spoke was the one that I wanted to mention, speaking to the little black kitten, and how it was so near and dear to Lovecraft, and that really had to have, as ST said, especially landing at a time when he's moving from his family home, and the cat runs away on top of it. I mean, he already kind of had a troubled enough situation as it was. So just to make matters worse. So yeah, Crimson Curse falls in Lovecraft's realm in that regard. So it's just a light treatise and a tip of the hat to the Cats of Ulthar.
A couple things I'd like to add about the Cats of Ulthar. It was written in 1920 during his sort of infatuation with Lord Dunsany, and it clearly betrays some influence of Dunsany. The kind of sort of naive or faux naive morality tale that story represents or constitutes is sort of a tip of the hat to Dunsany's stories in the Book of Wonder, which are very much along that same line. And he had just read Dunsany in the fall of 1919, just a few months before he wrote the story. The name Menes, a sort of a pseudo-Greek name, is probably taken from the great play by Lord Dunsany called King Argymenes and the Unknown Warrior. And even though what is mentioned in the story is like the Dark Wanderers, that phrase is taken right from the story Idle Days on the Yann, which influenced several other Lovecraft stories as well. So this story is heavily invested in Dunsany, but it also, as Katherine and others have pointed out, is something that speaks from the heart as well.
Yeah, he also takes off on it in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath as well. He really expands on his cat mythology in Ulthar. They're Randolph Carter's greatest allies, it seems like. They rescue him. There's cat armies and cat generals.
Actually, I promise not to talk too much, but just one thing I want to. In fact, as Andrew was reading that story, The Cats of Ulthar, it finally dawned on me. What is the real supernatural element in that story? It's about cats, killing and eating humans. Well, that could theoretically happen. That's not supernatural. The supernatural or maybe supernormal element is cats behaving in collective action. They don't do that. Dogs are pack animals. Cats are solitary. Even with a pride of lions, I mean, that's, the lionesses do the hunting individually. The lion, the male lion, just sits back, literally sleeps 20 hours a day, wakes up to have, eat and mate. Nice life, you can get it. But, even there, hunting is a solitary exercise. And similarly, that passage that Adam referred to in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where the cats form an army, that is a supernatural element.
I never really thought of that, but that is very unlikely, isn't it?
Right. I have an interesting question to stem off of that, ST. So speaking of supernatural element, in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, is that the first appearance that we actually see the Elder Sign?
I think so, yes, because well, no, well, I'd have to check my index to Lovecraft's fiction. He may have mentioned it in a previous, Dunsanian story. I can't remember, but it does use that element quite extensively in that story.
Well, Dream Quest is what, 1927?
26, 27, yeah.
It's fairly late.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he might have already used that.
Yeah, but the Dream Quest is a compendium of his previous Dunsanian stories stretching back to 1919. A lot of those elements from those stories get worked into that novella.
Well, the idea of the cats working together in an army being supernatural makes me think of the story of the King of the Cats, which is an old folk tale where a man is like in the forest and he comes across a cat funeral. There's like 6 cats holding a coffin with a crown on it, and he's like driven mad by the sight, and he runs home and tells his wife what he saw, and then his cat, who's sleeping by the fire, jumps up and says, "Then I am king of cats," because he must have been next in line, and then he jumps up the chimney, and is never seen from again. But the idea of the cats carrying a coffin kind of reminded me of that. Cats usually don't act in unison that way.
But before they eat the couple, they perform an unheard of ritual. And so that links them with the beyond, with those we cannot see but are there, or at least the dark forces, because when people are trying to decide what happened to the couple, they narrow it down to the cats and the dark forces. The cats are linked to them in ways we are not.
Cats have always been associated with witches and the supernatural. I mean,
Don't have me go. I have an essay.
Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general, actually put women to death for owning cats. Like that was one of.
And
Put the cats to death.
they put millions of cats were burned alive along with the witches. I have an essay in The Weird Cat, Cats in the Occult. From the Middle Ages, black cats were declared to be Satan incarnate by the Pope. And people, the Wicker Man, real. But all over Europe, over and over and over at the big festivals, animals, especially cats, were burned alive, hung by the tail over fires, or put in wicker baskets, thrown in sacks. They were burned by the thousands for over centuries.
Although that's a complete reversal to how the Egyptians treated them, because they were revered.
Yeah, it was Lovecraft's dichotomy. The classical, the Egyptian, revered cats, respected them. Medieval Christian Europe allowed trade with these heathens. They profited greatly by bringing in the silks and the teas and whatever. They also brought the domestication of cats to Europe. Oh, that was awful for the cats. They should have stayed where they were, or they should have stayed feral. Because once they started mousing for people, just think, we wouldn't be still hunter-gatherers if we hadn't had cats to guard our granaries.
Wasn't it true that the cats were domesticated in Egypt and the Near East?
And then the tradition was brought over here with the trade.
And classical Rome also.
Fairly late comers to Europe. Like they were brought to Rome, and then like later they made their way north to Britain.
But when they came over to medieval Europe, that's when they started being persecuted by the millions. As long as, every woman who owned a cat or gave a shelter to a cat who moused in exchange for her was suspected of witchcraft, and the cats
Well,
suffered
that's
the
how
same
the notion
sentences.
of the cat, the witch's familiar, came from. All sorts of animals, but I don't know, primarily cats, but other types of animals were also thought to be a familiar of a witch. And of course, Lovecraft, toward the end of his life, in 1932, kind of resurrected the whole witchcraft theme in, of all things, the Dreams in the Witch House, where Keziah Mason has a familiar who is a huge rat with human paws, Brown Jenkin, which I think is interesting in itself because he did not want a cat to be in that negative role of the witch's familiar, because that Keziah Mason is an evil entity who has to be banished at the end of the story.
With all this discussion about the history of how humans' relation with cats, it kind of reminds me of how things that we don't understand completely or seem to be supernatural, how sometimes they can actually play in our favor when we think, oh, okay, well, we find comfort in cats, or if they're associated with something we fear, we're going to burn them at the stake, and et cetera. It's interesting how when there are various facets of life that things that you might not understand can kind of serve the role of whoever is in charge, perhaps at the time in human history, and how that goes back and forth.
Cats still suffer from that association in the Middle Ages. How many people do you know who hate cats because they're independent and sneaky, and avoid black cats? Or some even try to hurt them.
Christians don't value individuality.
No.
Pagans were more respectful.
In 1926, that's a good segue. 1926, first, Lovecraft was living in a horrible life in New York City, but finally in April, actually in March, but his aunts, he was married and it was going very badly and he couldn't get a job and blah, blah, blah. His aunts finally said, Lovecraft, Howard, why don't you just come back home? And basically the subtext was, why don't you just dump your wife and forget about her and come back to live with us, which he did on April 17th of 1926. But later on in that year, he received an invitation from his New York friends. Oh, we're going to have a gathering of writers. We're going to talk about the relative merits of cats and dogs. And Lovecraft said, I'm not going to come back to New York just for that, but I'll write an essay which you can read. He told James Morton, you can read this essay, and that's my contribution to this discussion. And he wrote the essay Cats and Dogs in September, I believe. And he stressed exactly this idea of the cat's independence. And there's one passage, especially in contrast to dogs. We call ourselves a dog master. Who dared to call himself the master of a cat? We own a dog. He is with us as a slave and inferior because we wish him to be. But we entertain a cat. He adorns our hearth as a guest, fellow lodger, and equal because he wishes to be there. It is no compliment to be the stupidly idolized master of a dog whose instinct it is to idolize, but it is a very distinct tribute to be chosen as the friend and confidant of a philosophic cat who is wholly his own master and could easily choose another companion if he found such an one more agreeable and interesting. Now, of course, this whole essay is written in a sort of light, wistful, parodic sense, but there's an undercurrent of truth in all that.
Didn't he say that dogs are peasants and cats are gentlemen?
That's right. That's another great line. And the cat is classic and the dog is gothic.
Yeah. Cats are dignified. Cats are beautiful and dignified, which is really important to Lovecraft. Whip a cat and watch it glare and move backward, hissing in outraged dignity and self-respect. One more blow and it strikes you in return, for it is a gentleman and your equal, and will accept no one on personality and body of privileges.
I want to talk about the rats in the walls. We'll forget about the name. That one cat is actually one of several that owner has. You obviously know the premise of the story. An American, in his later years, decides to go back to his family home, Exham Priory, and refurbishes it and all that. But, it's a medieval castle, but all the insides have been renovated, apparently. And yet, not long after he goes in there, he hears the scurrying of the rats, and it's impossible. How can that be? And the critical point is, the cats hear it too. And what that means to me, a number of things. A, this is a genuinely supernatural event, because if it was only the human narrator, Delapore, who heard the scratching of the rats in the walls, you could pass that off as a hallucination or something. But the cats hear it too. And so therefore that sort of confirms the supernatural element in that story. And I think Lovecraft, I don't think he borrowed it from Algernon Blackwood, but he had just a couple of years before read Algernon Blackwood's story, A Psychical Invasion, in which, this is one of the John Silence stories, the psychic detective who goes and explores a haunted house, a cat and a dog, because he feels that both animals, but particularly the cat, are highly sensitive to the emanations of the weird. And I think Lovecraft sort of draws upon that in some of his stories.
In the story, the archaeologists enlist the help of the cats. They use them as sensors to help direct the... I'm sorry. In the story, the archaeologists use the cats as sensors. They enlist their help to track down the supernatural elements, the old city underneath the house.
Yeah, well, I mean, that makes you think that perhaps that's why witches had cats as familiars, because they're like psychic detectors. They can sense when they're ghosts or...
It's interesting how that theme bleeds into media in a more contemporary setting, when I just keep thinking of the cat Jonesy in the movie Alien. There are other references that I can't think of in this moment, but how this is kind of ubiquitous theme in contemporary setting that, oh yeah, cats are pretty helpful, or they detect such supernatural
They have kind
things.
of a liminal presence. Like they can kind of almost shift in and out of reality.
Right.
I think there was in Coraline, the book by Neil Gaiman, and the movie, there was like another alternate world, and the only one that could go back and forth freely between the two worlds was the cat. He could just walk in and out of the other world. And you kind of feel like that's possible, because cats do have a way of disappearing.
Right.
Speaking of Blackwood, also reminds me that he wrote, in my judgment, probably the greatest tale of cats and the supernatural, which is Ancient Sorceries, which is also in a John Silence book. We couldn't include that in The Weird Cat because the story is extremely long. It would take up like a third of the book, But if you haven't read Ancient Sorceries, oh man, it is a novella set in southern France where the suggestion, and only the suggestion, is that at night all the human inhabitants go away and become cats. It's a tale of metempsychosis. It is incredible, because even as humans, they behave in a cat-like manner, and the narrator senses this and says, something is very strange in this little town. I believe Lovecraft drew upon that not for specifically a cat story, but for The Shadow over Innsmouth, because the idea of this sort of hybridization of cat and human, a whole city where that happens is something that he may have picked up on for The Shadow over Innsmouth, which is something about a tale of human and fish hybrids. That's just one conjecture of mine. I think there are other stories about individual human-fish hybrids, like Irvin S. Cobb's Fish Head and Robert W. Chambers as the Harbor Master, which also worked into that thing. But the only story that I can think of where an entire town becomes converted is Ancient Sorceries.
But these special cat sensory abilities, knowledge, are accessible to those who love cats, such as Randolph Carter in The Dream Quest of the Unknown Cadet. He loves cats enough to learn their language and to communicate with them in a way that most people cannot, and that allows him greater knowledge of the cosmos.
It's interesting. Doesn't he also speak or learn the language of the ghouls in that tale as well?
Yeah, well, he was taught by the Pickman figure.
Oh, that's right.
Richard
Right.
Upton Pickman has become a ghoul in Dreamland. So that part of the story clearly was
Right.
written after he had written.
He's an atypical American traveler. He actually learns the languages
Yeah.
of the
Yuck,
places
yuck.
that he goes to.
Very funny. But yeah, that whole scene of the cats battling the Zoogs on the moon, right?
Yes.
Well, they can leap.
Well, that's the thing. Oh, again, I have to read you that passage. I could spend the whole panel just reading this book.
Lovecraft was
We come way second to actually reading Lovecraft.
I'll tell you, but yeah. So the cats and the Zoogs have this battle. Of course, the cats win. You know that's going to happen. So they're on the moon there, and the cat general says, "Okay, Randolph, you got to follow some orders here in order for us to get back to the moon, to the Earth." And he says, "Let me see here." Circle on circle they reached, and 2 or 3 leaders out of the ranks were licking his face and purring to him consolingly. Oops, that's not the passage. Sorry. After a brief consultation of generals, the cats rose and assumed a closer formation, crowding protectingly around Carter and preparing to take the great leap through space back to the housetops of our Earth and its dreamland. The old field marshal advised Carter to let himself be borne along smoothly and passively in the mass ranks of leaps, and told him how to spring when the rest sprang and land gracefully when the rest landed, because all cats land on their feet. He also offered to deposit him in any spot he desired, blah, blah, blah. And then the actual leap comes. Then, upon a signal, the cats all leaped gracefully with their friend packed securely in their midst, while in a black cave on a far unhallowed summit of the Moon Mountains still vainly waited the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. So Nyarlathotep does not like the cats, and that's one of the bad things about him.
I was wondering if Katherine and ST, you could take a moment to tell us about what stories are included, or ST's of HP's in The Weird Cat, because Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and Cats of Ulthar are not included in this. So what do folks have to look forward to?
We purposely chose little published things, little republished things. We didn't want to have the same stories everyone's read before. So as far as Lovecraft goes, we have The Cat and we have Old Man.
The Cats, plural, is a poem that Lovecraft wrote in 1925 in New York City, and it's set in a crazy sort of fantasy world of New York City where it's all apocalyptic, and the cats are the denizens of this world. It's actually one of the few horror poems, in fact, the only horror poem that Lovecraft wrote about cats. Not the cats that are themselves horrifying, but they are part of this weird scenario. You can just read a stanza or two, maybe.
Oh, I got the wrong page.
Yeah, this is actually
39?
39. Is that
Page 39.
39.
Oh, sorry, that's
the
MP
wrong
Shield.
Sorry.
57.
I will say that I published this poem first back in 1984, I think. It was an unpublished poem. I found the manuscript at Brown University, and I said, "Oh my God, this is a great poem. Why didn't you get it published?" So I
We wouldn't have Lovecraft in his current unadulterated form without the lifetime work of ST.
yeah, thank you.
The Cats. Babbles of blocks to the high heavens towering, flames of futility swirling below, poisonous fungi and brick and stone flowering, lanterns that shudder and death lights that glow. This is New York City. Black monstrous bridges across oily rivers, cobwebs of cable by nameless things spun, catacombs deep whose dank chaos delivers streams of life feeder that rots in the sun, colors and splendor, disease and decaying, shrieking and ringing and scrambling insane, exotic gods praying, jumbles of odor that stifle the brain, legions of cats from the alleys nocturnal, howling and lean in the glare of the moon, screaming the future with mouthings infernal, yelling the burden of Pluto's red rune, tall towers and pyramids, ivied and crumbling, bats that swoop low in the weed-cumbered streets. Bleak broken bridges o'er rivers whose rumbling joins with no voice as the thick tide retreats. Belfries that blackly against the moon totter, caverns whose mouths are by mosses effaced, and living to answer the wind and the water, only the lean cats that howl in the waste. So that was probably the major positive factor of New York City for Lovecraft, was the multitude of cats roaming the streets.
I have a whole section in this book of the cats of New York, which are just excerpts from letters. Because Lovecraft, he had a horrible time in those 2 years in New York, 24, 25, and into 26. Just dreadful. But he sort of put that aside by taking long walks around the city, either alone or with his friends, all night long sometimes. And he would come upon cats, and in letter after letter after letter, he just talks about these delightful cats he would find on a doorstep or in an alley, as he mentions that poem. And again, that is to some degree something that helped keep him sane. And I'll tell you, that she mentioned this thing called Old Man. That's my title for a letter that Lovecraft wrote late in life, around 1934, talking about a cat that he actually knew in Providence. He initially encountered this cat, not his cat. It was in 1906. He was 16 years old. It was at a market or something like that. Isn't that right? Mm-hmm. I think it was a cat associated with a grocery or market, something like that. He saw this cat all through his young manhood and into the 20s. Went to New York, came back in 1926. The cat was still there. It was like he must be 20 years old, and he started for a couple more years. The cat lived to be like 22 years old, and so he wrote this beautiful sort of prose poem about this ancient cat who might or might not take him off into wild voyagings into the spaces unknown. I'm not going to read the whole poem. The thing.
No, I'll read part of it.
Well, let me see.
Yeah, he first found the cat in 1906. In 1916, they were still friends. 1926. Old Man was still in the doorway when Lovecraft was 36, and in 1927 he had a bittersweet year where he had a second kittenhood, and then in 1928 he went into the eternal night.
Yeah, he says, in 1928 he seemed a trifle feeble, but his purring friendliness was unabated. Not long before my 38th birthday I saw him whom I had known at 16. Then in August I began to miss him. Always when turning the corner onto the hill, I used to look down ahead and see if I could discern a familiar lump of black, another black cat, by the archway or at the market. Now I failed to see the graceful old furry lump. I feared the worst, but scarcely dared to inquire at the market. At last, in September, I did inquire and found that my fears were all too well founded. After more than 2 decades, Old Man had gone through the archway at last and dissolved into that eternal night of which he was a true fragment. Just gorgeous. What this passage and all his discussions of his own pet cat lead me to think was, okay, Lovecraft loved cats, that's obvious, but the standard view of Lovecraft is always this cold, unemotional, straight-laced New Englander. No, in some ways Lovecraft was actually profoundly emotional, so emotional that when his own pet cat ran away, he could not bear for the rest of his life to own another cat because he didn't want to go through the heartache of losing a cat, whether by death or disappearance or whatever. God knows I have lost 6 cats over the years.
Is that why he never? I always kind of wondered, aside from his childhood cat, why he never. You'd think he would have.
No, he couldn't bear. It was too emotionally draining for him. He could not bear to go through that experience again. And even in this cat whom he just knew randomly as he walked along the street, go to the market, even the loss of that cat, he poured out his heart to this cat, and he was a profoundly emotional man.
St, do you think much you're talking about of his emotion and the loss of cats hitting so hard. Do you think it was also fueled by the loss of the adult figures in Lovecraft's life as a child too, or was it just his love
He
of
preferred cats to humans, and so do I.
Who doesn't?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, he obviously felt the loss of his father, and didn't see his father after about the age of 2.5 or 3 or whatever. Just heard kind of stories about him, what sort of person he was.
He was very cat-like himself. I mean, people accused Lovecraft of being cool and aloof and distant, and that's what people think of cats who don't really understand them.
And the other thing about cats is they are tied to places. They hate moving, and Lovecraft hated moving. So that's another bond there.
But he adopted and was adopted by Kappa Alpha Tau, cat club, a fraternity, sorority, that was established upon a roof of a neighboring house, and with whose members he became family. They frequently visited him. They were individuals, and he uses human terms to discuss the individual personalities of cats. Cats are not homogeneous. They have personalities for Lovecraft and anybody who loves cats. He calls them chap, visitor, guest, companion. Mrs. Spotty Perkins' latest child is what he calls a kitten. Little Sam Perkins is an imp from Azathoth's nethermost gulf of tenebrous chaos. And he has a big sister named Betsy. The vice president has produced dignity, and he should take up arms, though he'd rather negotiate. Randall shares Lovecraft's climactic tastes. He likes the warm sunlight. A younger one is undergoing initiation. He compares the cat fights of this group to the human battles of Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington. He has a special friend, Alfred Gelpin. He doesn't call them all Spot and stuff. He gives them names for their personalities. Alfred skipped and sidled toward one of the glorious hillside sunsets and passed into the fourth dimension, there to remain as Panther God Ra in the city of Never, always as young as on the day he came. And little Sam Perkins died. And who shall say the gods found him less important than the longest lived and worldliest philosopher? So his new black kitten, Johnny Perkins, who came later, hisses manfully and has a proud mama. And Lovecraft hopes he'll take care of his health and live longer than little Sam.
That little film, if you saw Short Blocks 1, it's called Lovecraft Loved Cats or something. The opening scene is the narrator reading 2-stanza poem, Little Sam Perkins, about this cat who lived only 3 months, again a black cat, was part of this Kappa Alpha Tau fraternity. He called it a fraternity because Lovecraft was at that time living on 66 College Street, which was Brown University's fraternity row, so that was the fraternity of cats that he came up with. Anyway, Lovecraft said, oh, that poor cat, he never saw a winter, and that's a poignant thing for him because he hated winter. He couldn't stand the cold, and it was in some ways a blessing that little Sam Perkins never felt the harshness of winter.
In our book, our book is populated with cat lovers writing for cat lovers, and also weird literature writers. Ambrose Bierce, Algernon Blackwood, William Blake, Adam Bolivar, Ramsey Campbell, Frank Kaufman, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Lord Dunsany, Jason Eckert, Alan Dean Foster.
Original story by Alan Dean Foster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Included per his request. Brandon Graffius, Lafcadio O'Hearn, myself, Caitlin Kiernan, Rudyard Kipling, Tony LaMalfa, Lori Lopez, Lovecraft, Edith Nesbitt, Elliot O'Donnell, Manuel Perez Campos, Michael Potts, Stephen Mark Rainey, Maria Rilke, Seth Romer, Hank Schwabel, Daryl Schweitzer, Robert Service, M.P. Scheil, Christina Singh, Anna Taborska, Mary Terzillo, M.F. Webb, and W.B. Yeats.
An impressive cast. Half, I don't know, original stories, poems, essays, reprinted poems, stories, essays, letters even. A good mix, I think. But, and it says no cat is mistreated in this volume. So I think Lovecraft would have approved of that. We should have some little time for questions. Okay, I have to read this thing. Toward the end of his life, and I think at this point Lovecraft knew he was dying, he went out to, in late 1936, to a pretty remote area. I mean, he'd like to take long walks, even when in his poor health. He went really far afield to this place called Quinsnicket Park, and he came upon 2 little cats. On my expedition of the 20th, that's 20th of October, a particularly congenial bodyguard or retinue attended me through the sunlit arcades of the grove in the persons, note that, of 2 tiny kittens, one gray and one tortoiseshell, who appeared out of nowhere in the midst of the sylvan solitudes, blithe spirits of the ancient woods, furry fawnlets of the shadowy vale. I wonder where their mother was. Judging by their diminutiveness, they could scarce have been fully graduated from her as a source of nourishment. Probably they appertain to an hospital whose grounds are contiguous with the mystical forest. Both of them were at first very timid and reluctant to let Grandpa catch them, but eventually the little gray fellow became very purrful and climbing old gentleman, playing with twigs and with Grandpa's watch charm, and eventually curling up and going to sleep in the grandpaternal lap. But little brother remained suspicious and aloof, clawing and spitting with surprising vehemence on the one occasion when Grandpa caught him. He hung around, however, because he didn't want to lose his brother. Blah, 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 blah. It goes on for a little bit. But it's such a charming passage. And how that he was dead, but at least he had this memory to cling to of this final association with cats. And so we have a little time for questions. Any questions or comments?
Go ahead.
I wonder if the panel would say a few words about the influence of Lovecraft's cats on Rogers and Lasby's novel, A Night in the Lonesome October.
I am mortified to say that I have not read that book. It has been recommended to me. I have not gotten around to it. Oh, all right. Has it?
I've actually not read it. I think.
Oh, how embarrassing.
I keep it.
We are deficient. Sorry.
That's
0 for
a
3
good
here.
recommendation for a book, though.
Yeah, I know. Somebody gave me a copy of it, and I said, I'll get to it one of these days.
I know there's people who read it every October as a tradition.
Other questions? Good one, thank you.
Oh, I'd like to invite all of you to the Doubletree Hilton. In one of the 2 hallways off the lobby, there are numerous alcoves, and we're going to have a book launching from 5 to 6. And we'll give you...
About the weird cat.
Yes, the weird cat. We will buy you a drink and give you some munchies for your time.
We have alcohol and non-alcoholic beverages available.
Can I close out with a quote from Kipling, which I think is appropriate? It echoes Lovecraft's sentiments. He wrote a poem where he wrote, I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are the same to me.
That story is from Just So Stories, and it is included in our
in there.
volume. It's
It's like-
about
It's a story.
how cats are only domesticatable as much as they wish to be.
Anyway, thanks very much, and all hail to cats.
Yeah.
Cats rule, dogs drool.